Good evening. Welcome all. Welcome friends. Welcome to all those who are live streaming online. We are delighted to close out our policy season for the spring summer with David Kang of USC. And David has traveled across the country simply to be with us here tonight. And so, David, we're very honored. David is a commentator and scholar of tremendous note and one of the leaders really in the West Coast School of Thought on Korea, and certainly nationally as well. What he has done at USC is quite remarkable. We'll get into that in a moment, but it is certainly one of the more dynamic programs in the country, and so we here at the Korea Society are extremely honored to have David. I did also want to point out by way of welcome that we're delighted to have Fred Carrier back, a former Executive Vice President of the Korea Society. Fred, thank you for taking the time. And Mark Gaston, a member of our board who has given us so much wise counsel over the years. So thank you both. And thank you, friends in the room. I know we have some of our very regular policy constituents, and we're very delighted that you took the time to be with us. One of the great things about welcoming David is we're welcoming also a scholar who has had tremendous range in terms of his impact. He has had an openness of mind and a great encouragement, I think, to the process to welcome alternative perspectives and to welcome more progressive views of how we look at the situation on the Korean Peninsula. As you will find shortly, David's a very dynamic presenter as well. So, David, thank you, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you. We've tentatively given this the talk title of Progress in U.S.-Korea Relations. So we'll look at the health of the bilateral relationship as it stands now, reflections on some of the challenges this year vis-a-vis North Korea, its implications for the U.S. and Korea. But we'll get to that after we say welcome and nice to have you here, and
Thank
congratulations
you so much for
on your
having me.
success.
It's a delight to be
Thank
here.
you. I'd actually like to start first and foremost by your sharing with our group about your success out at USC.
Sure.
On your mailing list, I must say, I'm extremely impressed with the range of your programming.
Well, thanks. I mean, I will give a shameless plug for USC Korean Studies. Fighting. But I went out to USC 7 years ago, and I went out in order to make USC Korean Studies one of the best places in the world, because it should be. I mean, this is a wonderful university in Los Angeles, about a mile from K-Town, which has like the largest number of Koreans outside of Korea. It's an extraordinarily vibrant place if you go to Los Angeles. And you don't have to convince anyone when you're in California that Asia's important. It's obvious. And so what we've been trying to do at USC has been to take Korea and engage the mainstream debates where normally they really are sort of on the East Coast, which is fine. I mean, this is the centers of finance and politics. But the West Coast can bring a perspective that is not traditional, but takes for granted the importance of Asia. And so that's what we've been trying to emphasize, is how central Korea is, how proud Korea is. If you're in California, you're not embarrassed to be Korean. You know, it's so obvious it's important. So it's a very different perspective that we've been trying to build out at USC. And I think we're well on the way to hopefully having an impact on like policy and then also on scholarship.
No, that's terrific, David. Thank you. And I should note, I guess, in that vein, that we had Steph Haggard here from UCSD this spring. We've had Clark Sorensen from the University of Washington. Of course, we've very good friends at both Stanford and Berkeley, and we had David Straub and Geun-hye Shin here on several occasions. And so we're really, really very happy that you could be with us and round that out. I also was looking yesterday at an article that was done back in 2010 about you and Victor Cha. Victor has been up here from Washington routinely and has seen many of the people here in this room. And interesting in that article, they sort of pair you two as you know, the great young minds on Korea-U.S. relations, but also two who have very opposite perspectives on some things, although a very common commitment to peace on the peninsula, stability, and a vital relationship, which is that between Korea and the United States.
Yeah, and go ahead.
No,
you know, the thing that's interesting about Victor is that we really do represent sort of East and West Coast, right, and then sort of more mainstream and perhaps a little more as you said, alternative perspectives. But the one great thing about Victor is that what he said early on in our career, because we got jobs, we finished our PhDs roughly the same time. We got jobs roughly the same time. I at Dartmouth, he at Georgetown. And we're early on, and we said, we're so much better if we help each other out.
Mm.
And over the last 20 years, that's what we've done. And I think I'm very proud of the kind of collaborations that we do. Because it really does make, there's so much that everybody agrees on. Almost everybody wants a strong U.S.-Korea relationship. Everybody wants progress with North Korea. We may disagree about how to do it, but let's try and find a way. And so it's been great to work with Victor that way.
Oh, that's terrific. Well, let's talk about some of the particulars. And I guess first and foremost, if you could give us your assessment of where we are in terms of the relationship between the United States and the ROK, and how you've seen that develop in terms of what you may see as progress or limitations.
Sure. I think, if it's easy to go back 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, and lots of talk under particularly No Mu-hyun regime in the early 2000s about troubles in the U.S.-Korea relationship. But it was always clear that even though the alliance may have adjustments, that the relationship was not going to go away. We were not going to stop trading with South Korea. We're not going to stop interacting with each other. We weren't going to. Immigrants were not going to keep going. Go home. Everyone is not going to move home. And so it was really managing this growth process that was really the issue. And if you look at it today, I think the U.S.-Korea relationship is very, very stable. The one thing I would point out, though, and I think I find myself keep saying this, which is Korea will never act totally the way Americans wish it would. And if I had one thing that I keep, sort of a drum I keep beating, which is Korea has its own strategic culture. It has its own viewpoint on the world. And to have a deep, positive, warm relationship with the United States does not preclude independent views of Korea towards other countries. And so in some ways, I think Korea will always have a good relationship with the United States. But in other ways, the South Korea and the Korean Peninsula will usually chart its own path. And I think in America, we tend to keep hoping that it will eventually see the world the way we do. Mm. But it's not. And I'll give you one example. My little drumbeat is this. Korea is less skeptical of China than probably the mainstream American policymaker. And it is more skeptical of Japan than Americans wish it would be. There are reasons for it. It's probably not going to change in the short term. And so American policy that hopes or is built on trying to get Korea to act and view the world the same way as it does is probably going to be more difficult than trying to work within a Korea. And the example is, Park Geun-hye, as much as we may laugh, she went with Xi Jinping and Putin and there's Park at the October commemoration. Right? That wasn't a one-off. Lee Myung-bak did it. Right? When Xi Jinping welcomed Park Geun-hye, he quoted poetry from Taechiwon. I don't know if you guys know this, right? The 9th century Korean who went and studied in China and passed the Chinese civil service exam. So these relations are so complex and so deep in ways that we in America may not quite understand why Korea views the world a little differently. So I think the relationship is great. Mm-hmm. It probably won't be as easy a relationship as we ever wish it would. Mm.
We tend to fill the room here whenever we talk about China-Korean relations, and that seems to be an area of really growing enthusiasm for our policy crowds and our online viewers and listeners. And I'd like to push you a bit more on that, because in, I guess it was 2007, you had out a book that had tremendous resonance in terms of China's rise. And you have now just mentioned this in terms of Korea's insights and perhaps warmer relationship than most Americans might give it credit for. How do you think that plays out in terms of U.S.-Korea relations relative to U.S. expectations on South Korea, in how we may say it's balancing Beijing and Washington? Mm-hmm. How do you think it plays out in terms of our expectation that China will be the deciding voice on North Korea, or can be the principal
Yeah.
mover on North Korea?
Well, I think, and in part, I think one reason South Korean politicians want to have good relations with China is precisely because of their influence over North Korea, and precisely because China is a very important element of any kind of peninsular reconciliation or any kind of issues that go on, right? Um, and so I think that that's a very important component. But I do think that probably a larger element of that is that South Korea, another way, and I'm gonna copy from John Park here, who uses it. South Korea in a way is like the canary in the coal mine. It's the case study of East Asia that if we pay close enough attention to can really tell us far more than just being another country. And the reason I say this is because I think South Korea's fundamental goal, one of their enduring goals, whether it was on the right, Park Geun-hye or Lee Myung-bak, or on the left, Kim Dae-jung or Roh Moo-hyun, is to not have to choose between the United States and China, and to not get caught in larger U.S.-China relations. They really, really don't want to take sides. I would say, parenthetically, I think Japan is happy to take the U.S. side. We view Japan in America a little bit more as an ally. That's the way they should all think, right? Korea is not going to do that. And they're not moving away. China's going to be there, right? And they know how to have good relations. Again, I go back to how Koreans know they are going to interact with China. And so as a result, I think, what happens is that one of the fundamental tasks for South Korean policymakers going forward is how to manage living next to this massive country. And that's going to be an enduring foreign policy challenge. Doesn't mean Koreans like China, but they will live with it. And I don't think they feel any fundamental need to isolate themselves from it. And that's something that we in the United States can view a little bit. It'll help make American foreign policy making more smooth if we realize that this is not going to be an either-or situation.
Mm-hmm. So when I read Secretary Russell, Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia Pacific, Daniel Russell's comments this week about the dialogue that the United States is having with China, and how in this particular round it will fundamentally focus on moving the North Koreans back to the negotiating table.
Yeah.
Is it fair to be pushing China? And we started off the year after the nuclear test and before the missile launch in February, with a strong arm on Beijing to make things happen. This is different. Is that expectation on the part of U.S. policymakers
Absolutely
fair?
right? And I'm glad we got to North Korea, because this is a classic example where my take on the whole recent UN sanctions and the United States is this, right? We just this week we heard Evans Revere and Wendy Sherman come out with very hardline stances about we need to amp up the pressure. The Chinese signed on to the recent UN sanctions with my understanding being an explicit addendum, meaning these sanctions are fine, but the United States, must offer an exit ramp for negotiation. You must show a path towards negotiation. And so that's where I see Russell's comments being, I hope the Obama administration is actually doing that, which is it has to be two-pronged. Won't be simply the pressure. There must be an exit ramp that is viable towards trying to find a way back. And that's my read of the Chinese take on it. They're very frustrated with North Korea, but fundamentally they still want to get back to negotiations. And it's very easy for us to poo-poo them. But I think the Chinese have very clearly told the U.S., without the negotiations, I'm not sure how far we're willing to go with just punishment or sanctions. And so I think as the Obama administration ends up, whoever takes over will have a real decision to make about how they approach North Korea and how that plays into China policy for the United States.
If I remember correctly, I think in your critique of the agreed framework and its aftermath, you similarly pointed out that there was another component beyond simply light water reactors, which was the normalization aspect, and that we missed an opportunity in
Yes.
some extent to pursue that
Yeah.
road. Which leads me to sort of ask you where you think things are now relative to the Party Congress that has just concluded these tests, and we've just had a
Another
UN Security
fizzled.
Council resolution
Yeah.
or statement yesterday, I should say, about the failed
Yeah.
intermediate ballistic missile tests, and where we might go in terms of a fifth or a sixth nuclear test.
Yeah.
What do you think that means in terms of both the reaction toward North Korea and U.S.-South Korean solidity on these fronts? How that could change with political change in South Korea, I should say.
Sure, sure. You know, I was a lot more optimistic 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It's getting now 50, in the late 90s, the early 2000s, I really do think we had a missed opportunity to make real progress on denuclearization. Where we are now is, I think, in the United States, both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, are tired of trying initiatives with North Korea. My reading of North Korea is that they are tired of trying initiatives with us, right? And I think everybody has decided we'll never be able to negotiate with the other side, which is why we're where we are today. The latest round of missile tests, sanctions, et cetera, led to the question of, is this really different? Is this time different? Because people were saying, China's on board, right? And I kept saying, I actually think they're on board in a different way than you think, right? I don't fundamentally see a lot of change on the peninsula right now. In other words, if we were to say, is China ready to really pull out, really put the stops on North Korea? I don't see that. I don't see evidence of that yet, right? I don't see evidence, unfortunately, that North Korea sees any impending real crisis. And in fact, I think the Party Congress is a great example of that. That, to me, my short reading of it was that was a very status quo type of business or business as usual type of Party Congress, in the sense of, I didn't see crisis, I didn't see drastic changes, right? So the question would be, is the United States, are the sanctions, as stated in January, February, whatever, are they going to have enough bite to force North Korea to change? And I'm not sure they will. Right? I'm not sure that we ever will be able to, because I think we're fundamentally in the same issue. And maybe the way that I would put it is this, right? For 20 years, maybe even longer, we have been stuck. Everybody knows how this game is played. It's actually very stable. Deterrence, fist shaking, name calling, but nobody really wants to start a war. So there are upper limits on how coercive we can be. There are also lower limits or other limits on how much anyone is really truly willing to engage with North Korea. Almost nobody is really willing to actually live with North Korea and just trade with them and interact with them as a normal country. So we have a very limited range of policy options. Nobody wants to start a war. Nobody wants to live with North Korea the way it is. And so we keep going back and forth within this band. And I think we're still within this band. I used to hope that North Korea was, I actually was hopeful after Kim Jong-un took over. Because if there was a time that North Korea was going to fall apart internally, it was probably with a weak, untried, young leader, etc. But he's been in power now 4 years. If he was going to fail, he probably was going to fail a lot earlier on. And I don't see, again, my reading is, I don't see a lot of cracks in the edifice. This is a very pessimistic viewpoint. But where I am right now is, I actually think it's more stasis or more status quo than any kind of change. So I don't actually think there's a lot that's different right now. We'll see, but I don't see North Korea falling apart. Yeah.
How do you think that plays relative to the US-ROK relationship, in the sense that, at least for the remainder of the Park Geun-hye administration, and especially given maybe the April parliamentary election results, which were at minimum a slap on the wrist to the Noerper party, the ruling party, one would expect perhaps no dramatic change on foreign policy, though events in a crisis could lead to something. But the real question, I guess, lies more around the corner with the presidential election. And if if an opposition candidate was to win, would
Yeah.
that potentially open different directions in terms of inter-Korean dialogue? There were some observers of the April elections who said some members of the voting populace felt that this administration had limited things, the cutoff of Kaesong and others, they were unhappy. Though I think most analysts would agree most of the parliamentary elections were about domestic
Yeah.
economic issues, reform, household debt, jobs, etc. But some have pointed out that there was an element on North Korea policy and foreign policy that could be part of it. How do you think all this plays out as we go forward in the next
Yeah.
year or two or three?
Clearly, U.S. policy, I think, is on hold until there's a new president. I mean, Obama may do a little bit, but one of the problems with the U.S. side is of 55 domestic and foreign policy issues, North Korea is always 56th. Right? There are so many other things that matter, so many other things where you can obviously make a change. North Korea, it's very hard to figure out what a U.S. president could waste political capital on that might have any effect. So we do that with sanctions, name calling, etc. For South Korea, I think, Park Geun-hye started out with some trust politic, with some initiatives that I thought were, very forward-leaning. Clearly, she has become disillusioned with that, and so the pullback from Kaesong, essentially a much more hardline stance she's ended up with. But as we know in Korean society, there will be a greater reservoir of openness to alternative approaches simply because they have to live with North Korea in a way that the United States doesn't. So there will be probably more possibility for different types of policy options with the new president than there are in the United States because it's right there. How that plays out 19 months or whatever it is now the presidential election is really hard to say because Park Geun-hye is a long time now, as you said, is a lame duck with a parliament that is not going to change while she's still president. So if I had to guess, Korean politics will be also in a bit of a stasis because she doesn't have the parliamentary majority anymore. So her ability to make initiatives will be limited, although obviously she has she can do a lot of things.
Let's ask the B side and look at our own process here. I hear from many of my Korean friends that they are at least as puzzled as we all are about the current campaign cycle. And what do you think the interpretation is among Koreans vested in our relationship when they hear what they've heard from Donald Trump, what they may see in the possibility of Secretary Clinton?
Yeah. As you said, this is extraordinarily puzzling. Everyone I know, I'm in a political science department. Everybody I know who studies American politics has been wrong over the last year and a half. He can't possibly this. That will never that. I mean, Sanders can never blah, blah, right? I mean, it's nobody I know who I respect has gotten it, essentially right. So we're all guessing at what's going on. But we're down to two. And what's interesting about these two is that in a way you get when the Wendy Sherman had a statement, a speech, just I think sometime this week, and very close to Hillary Clinton. If it's any reflection of Clinton as we know, it was a very hawkish speech about North Korea. It was about things haven't worked, we need to ramp up the pressure, sanctions, etc. And as Hillary Clinton has said, she is, I forget the phrase now, but she wants to try and make mistakes rather than not try at all. It's very different from Obama, who did not want to get caught in traps. So I think we have a more hawkish president if Clinton wins, with a policy towards at least North Korea that will be more hardline. No one expected Donald Trump to be the last Republican standing. I have no idea whether what he says is what he would actually do. But to talk about abrogating the US-ROK alliance, to talk about abrogating free trade agreements, to talk about, the only thing I'd say is if what he has said actually comes to pass, there would be chaos in all U.S. policy towards. I can't imagine how that would happen. But I don't think he would actually do that. I mean, you have to hope that when he gets in there, he realizes how important the U.S.-Korea relationship is, how important the free trade agreement is, how important it is to have a consistent policy towards North Korea. But I actually am as baffled as anyone. I study North Korean politics, and that's in some ways a little more straightforward.
Interesting. But let me ask you about then to
and so they sort of switched, right? The Republicans now the Democrats.
There you go. By way of a soft follow-up, then you had the nuclearization issue in terms of Trump's comment relative to South Korea and Japan going nuclear to counter North Korean nuclear capability. You've also had this comment about Trump's suggestion of meeting with Kim Jong-un.
Yeah. Well, again, this is where sort of like Hillary's become the right winger, and Trump is now the lefty willing to go shake hands with Kim Jong-un, make a deal. Part of this, though, I mean, part of this is literally talk, because one of the things that, people always throw out this card: South Korea and Japan will go nuclear. If they were truly afraid, I think they would have gone nuclear a long time ago. Mm-hmm. Because I don't see what's getting any worse with 6 to 8 nukes as opposed, or whatever, 10 to 12 nukes versus 6 to 8, right? And fundamentally, this South Korean and Japanese decisions not to go nuclear are a result of their decisions that their own national security is actually increased by not being a nuclear state and by not raising the stakes. And I think that's the wise choice. I think that's incredibly smart. Most countries realize that to try and play a nuclear game makes your entire survival contingent on a military solution. And it's clear that South Korea and Japan view diplomatic, economic, social ties as being far more important to their national security than military is an important component, but it's not the only one. To go nuclear is to totally throw out that other stuff and say, I'm only going to be able to raise tensions everywhere. So I doubt South Korea or Japan would, it would have to be a lot more for them to really consider this path. So I don't think Trump in that sense would I'm not sure how that could play in. But I think fundamentally that's why we haven't had more moves by either of these countries, or frankly a Taiwan, or a Philippines, or a Vietnam. I mean, if North Korea can go nuclear, Vietnam can go nuclear, right? There's a reason these countries aren't. They view their national security as much more multifaceted. And again, to follow up on the President Trump issue is just really the question of what he would do if he was really in power, because these free trade agreements are incredibly important. I know both Trump and Hillary Clinton are opposed to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'm deeply in favor of the TPP. This is an agreement, a high-quality trade agreement that will raise standards across the region, that both of our presidential candidates on the Democrats and Republicans have come out against it. I find deeply troubling for America's influence in Asia, because the region continues to evolve and move along. And that's where I go back to South Korea as a canary in the coal mine. We need to understand they're not focused only on the United States. And it will be our choice as to whether we are involved and helping to shape the region, or if we're not. And if we're not involved in making economic new rules that help to move beyond 1940s era rules and agreements like the WTO and the GATT, then we're the ones who are going to suffer. And so I find that, in a way, deeply troubling. Yeah.
No, Dave, that's incredibly compelling. And I think, the point on TPP, if there was a threat to its ratification, would leave such question marks in Asian minds, which leads me to a last question before I move to our audience, which is, how do we build the stakes on a new relationship between the U.S. and South Korea and others in the region that revitalizes it, that gives it new impetus, that defines it for a new era?
Yeah. I'll say, I hope this doesn't sound like a campaign speech, but I actually firmly believe it. I think that the Obama rebalance started out with forward deployed diplomacy as the first element, with economic initiatives the second element. And the military component was going to be reduced. It was widely agreed in the 5 or 6 years ago that the military was overstretched, involved in 2 wars in the Middle East, et cetera, and that a true American diplomacy towards Asia, let me put it another way. The reason we care about Asia over the last 50 years is not war. It's because of phenomenal economic growth and social dynamism and maturation of countries around that region. And that's where we should start. And I think a policy that emphasizes the economic and social dimension of America's relationship with Asia is the way that we move forward. The military will always be a component. That's very clearly an important component. But to only focus on that is to miss the larger reason why we care. We care because of Samsung and Huawei and immigration and trade and investment back and forth. And so I think the foundations of a really forward-looking American foreign policy or grand strategy to Asia recognizes that the region is about much more than simply military issues. And particularly with U.S.-Korea, there's so much there beyond North Korea that we can build upon. And I hope that both candidates would actually take that as their starting point.
David Kang, thank you very much for your time this evening. Thank you for your very eloquent observations and really a very positive lean forward into the relationship. And we're grateful to you for that. We do hope that we can see you back at the Korea Society sometime soon.
Thank you.
We'll certainly look you up at USC.
Great.
And congratulations on all the progress you have made in your 6 years there. And it's important for us here to remember that there is a West Coast school that is working very hard, diligently, and you've helped move us out of our New York, Boston, Washington mindsets. Thank you, and thank you to all of you in the audience and to those who have listened.
Thank you.
And
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.